It's being called a red alert. A major source of Arizona's water supply has shrunk to historic lows, and there's no sign of a let-up in the West's ongoing water crisis. Lake Mead is part of the Colorado River, which provides critical drinking water to Arizona, 40% of the water in our state, as well as water to Nevada, California, and parts of Mexico. It also provides electricity for the states. According to the Arizona Republic, the reservoir has sunk to its lowest levels since it was filled back in the 1930s. And experts say help is not on the way. A historic 20-year drought and climate change are starving the lake of rain and snowmelt to replenish the water supply. So what does this mean for all of us, our lives and livelihoods here in the desert, and what needs to be done now? The Arizona Republic's Ian James joins us. He reports on water, climate change, and the environment. His coverage of our water crisis has set the agenda for the national conversation. Welcome to Square Off.
Thanks for having me.
So here's kind of the problem in talking about this. We have water to make coffee, take a shower every morning, and fill 25,000-gallon pools. How do you explain to the average person why this latest news about Lake Mead is a red alert?
That's right. Water continues to come out of the tap, and so it may not register necessarily. But the situation is serious. Lake Mead is at its lowest level since the 1930s at about 36% full. And this is being driven by multiple factors. It's being driven by the chronic overuse of the river. It's being driven by really dry conditions, and then also warmer temperatures that over time, as the experts describe it, a warmer atmosphere is a thirstier atmosphere. So it's having an additional effect on that river.
And the story is kind of a drip, drip, drip. Sorry to use the pun, but I just want to get to the sense of urgency, because from reading your coverage, as I read the comments of water experts, they're no longer like praying for rain anymore. They're saying we need to do something now. Is that how you read it? I just haven't heard that sense of urgency before.
I think you're right about that. And there was an agreement in 2019 among the states, California, Nevada, and Arizona, to take less water in the river, to work together to try to prevent the reservoir from reaching lower levels that would be really problematic. Now, that plan is being put into place. And so this coming year will be the first time that there will be what's called a tier 1 shortage. So for Arizona, that means losing about 512,000 acre feet of water, which turns out to be about a third of the water that flows through the CAP canal to Phoenix and Tucson and these areas. So there is a plan, as Arizona's water officials have said repeatedly, to deal with the situation. But I think what we're seeing as Lake Mead continues to decline is that the responses to the problems on the Colorado River are not enough and not happening fast enough for the scale of the dryness out there.
And let's talk about it in a second, but I want to get back to what you just said. 1/3 of the water from the Central Arizona Project will be lost, will be gone?
That's right. Under this agreement, which basically increased the amount of water that Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico would need to leave in the lake. And so that's being carried out now in 2022. If Lake Mead continues to decline to lower level thresholds, then larger cutbacks in water deliveries will happen. And there are plans for dealing with all this, as the state has agreed to and laid out. But I think what I'm hearing a lot from the researchers lately is just that, what's been done to date is admirable and good, but it's not keeping up with the scale of the changes.
Who will lose water as a result of that 1/3 cutback?
In the coming year, it'll be primarily farmers in Pinal County who had been expecting that they would eventually lose their water. It's just happening a lot faster than they would have expected a decade ago.
And you've been talking about the drought contingency agreement signed 2 years ago. Governor Doug Ducey hailed it as historic. And it sounds like it's already lost its impact. It's not doing what we hoped it would do. It's out of date.
Well, I know that is certainly a perspective that's out there, and I think it's it is an important point and one that I've heard from, several of the top water regulators and officials in Arizona that, it would have happened a lot faster were it not for this agreement. So as a result of voluntary conservation steps and the cuts that have happened under this agreement, it's pushed Lake Mead a bit higher and pushed back the onset of this shortage. But now we're there.
So
and it's, the projections are that over the next year or two, the way things are headed, that it will continue to decline significantly. So, things are, I think, not going in the direction that people had hoped 2 years ago when they signed this. They didn't expect it would deteriorate so quickly.
So how might future cutbacks affect the average water user, people who turn on the tap?
Well, so far, I think it's not likely to affect the average water user at all because there are no plans for mandatory reductions in water use that I've heard of. Individual cities could take steps to ask their customers to conserve more. Certainly what I'm hearing from people who study the Colorado River deeply is that all conservation helps, whether that's in cities, in farms, which consume about 70% of the water from the Colorado River. All conservation efforts will be important, as will things like recycling wastewater increasingly, although that's more a long-term investment, and also, potentially desalination. So there's a lot being talked about to deal with this in the long term. But the upshot is this water source is yielding less, and so there's going to be a need to adapt to less water from that river.
The governor plans to put money in the budget for potential desalination plants, for potential purchases of water from other states. When you say long term, how long is the long term? How far away is that? Because, again, judging by what happened with the drought contingency agreement, the long term keeps getting shorter and shorter.
That's true. And so that's something that I have heard from several researchers, is that it's time that these changes and efforts to adapt really need to speed up to deal with the changes on the ground. But when we're talking about longer term, what I'm referring to is that, for instance, the Central Arizona Project is looking at the possibility of helping Metropolitan Water District in Southern California invest in a wastewater recycling project through which Arizona would then be able to get some water because of that investment. But that's something that's about 2030, so about 10 years out. I mean, all these things take time to plan. So that's what's being discussed now.
Do the experts think we have that much time? Because Lake Mead is cone-shaped, and it could be sinking much faster.
That's right. And so one viewpoint that I've heard is that we may not have until 2026, when the current rules expire, to really come up with a better system for dealing with the scale of these changes. It may be that the states will, before 2026, if things continue to deteriorate, might need to get back together again and talk more about what to do next. And there is sort of a backstop in the existing agreement that if it's likely to head to those critically low levels within that period, that the Secretary of the Interior could then call the states back together and say, what additional steps do we need to take to deal with this?
One thing we haven't discussed is Hoover Dam. It generates electricity from the water in those reservoirs. And you wrote a tremendous story a few weeks ago on Hoover Dam, its history, and the stake for all of us. And at the very end, you wrote about the risk of the generators, quote, falling silent. Reading that, I found it chilling. How real is that scenario?
Well, I think the answer, it really depends on how things play out over the next few years. But people are talking about that as a worst case scenario that is out there, that at some point, if Lake Mead continues to decline, it could reach what's called a dead pool level, at which it would no longer be able to generate power. Water would no longer pass through the dams. I mean, it's a ways off, but the way things have been going lately with just incredibly dry conditions, warmer temperatures in the upper watershed in the Rocky Mountains that feeds this river, things have been happening more rapidly than even federal water managers had predicted a year or several months ago.
A lot to think about, big issue for our current governor and our next governor. Ian James, thank you so much for your reporting, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.